Hello and welcome to Common Sense Ethics. I'm Leah. Tonight I want to talk quickly about misinformation and censorship and why these two things are really problematic recently. So you'll hear a lot of claims, or statements to the following effect. X is misinformation and X should be censored. And I want to say that both of these claims are quite problematic, and I'm going to explain why. So first, let's focus on misinformation. Now, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to ignore sort of the more disingenuous reasons why someone might label something misinformation. Those could be partisan reasons or, to cover up corruption or all kinds of sort of more disingenuous reasons. And I'd like to just set those aside for now and focus on the honest reasons why something might get labeled misinformation, but why it's problematic anyway to do that. So the first reason is that new and better information can always come to light about anything. And there's been a really good example that I'd like to focus on. I don't like to talk too much about current events, but this example just really illustrates quite well why this is the case. So in early 2020, it was, when the pandemic first started, it was verboten to mention the lab leak hypothesis, that COVID could have started by leaking from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That topic was a third rail topic, and anyone who mentioned it was immediately shut down as being misinformation, right? But then in 2021, more information about it sort of emerged, and the Overton window shifted and it was suddenly not only acceptable to talk about that, but I mean, it almost might be the dominant sort of hypothesis about the origins of COVID, right? So there you have it. What was, in 2020, a conspiracy theory is now an accepted hypothesis. And, by labeling it misinformation in 2020, that really calls into question, whether that should have been done. It wasn't that it was misinformation, and it's just that a lot is still unknown. A lot was unknown then, but it's a lot still unknown now. So it's problematic to refer to something definitively like that as misinformation. The second problem with labeling things as misinformation is that no one is infallible in their knowledge. Not even experts, experts aren't necessarily infallible. Nobody is. No one has complete knowledge of any one subject or of everything generally. And, there's a lot of reasons why this might be the case. Someone could look at data and draw, a different conclusion than somebody else. Someone, could not have access to some sort of obscure facts that another person does. Someone could be using a model to sort of try to predict what will happen. An expert could be doing that, and they could leave one or two things out of the model, and that skews the entire result. And also confirmation bias. Everybody, even experts and scientists, are subject to these cognitive biases that we all are. And there was even a study done that showed that scientists are not immune from confirmation bias, that they would sometimes formulate an hypothesis, and then if during an experiment something came up that was anomalous, that didn't fit in with their hypothesis, that they would ignore it, sometimes even repeatedly. So this just shows you how powerful some of these cognitive biases really are. So there's all these sort of interplay that goes into no one being really infallible. And that's another reason that I don't really think that it's a great idea to label things definitively as misinformation when they're in flux or when more information could come to light and so on. And third, if you really want to get philosophical about it, Socrates wholeheartedly made it clear that the more he thought he knew, the more his ignorance became apparent to him. And this sort of philosophy was also common among the skeptics and the ancient Taoist philosophers, and also to some extent Hindu and Buddhist philosophers. And they said that since reality is always changing, minute to minute, second to second, that it's kind of ridiculous to think that we have access to certain knowledge, about anything, even if we convince ourselves that we do. And so, there it really takes arrogance to sort of say definitively that X is misinformation, if it's not something that is really known to you firsthand. And even then, you could make a case for why that shouldn't be done. But, what's takes even more arrogance than declaring something misinformation is then calling to censor it, right? So I'm sure you'll see where I'm going here with this issue of censorship. So let's get back to the first thing I mentioned about the lab leak hypothesis, right? So in 2020, Zero Hedge, which is a news website, they ran an article about the lab leak hypothesis, with what limited information there was available at the time, right? They were speculating about it. And I think they like to tweet out some of their news articles. But anyway, they put it on Twitter, and Twitter not only took down the article, but banned them, and I don't think it was a permanent ban, but in any event, they were censored and deplatformed, at least temporarily, for talking about this lab leak hypothesis. And then 2021 rolls around, and suddenly this is no longer misinformation, but something that people, talk about, and is generally kind of accepted to be a good explanation for the origins of COVID. So it was like the Overton window shifted, and suddenly last year's misinformation became this year's sort of accepted hypothesis, right? Yet they were censored for reporting on that ahead of the curve. And I'm sure you can see why that is problematic. And the second really major problem with just censorship in general is, who decides? Who decides what should be censored and what shouldn't? I don't think that anyone is really fully qualified to decide that, for the reasons that I mentioned before, that even experts aren't infallible, and we are all subject to cognitive biases and confirmation bias in particular. And it's not really within anybody's expertise to say this is definitive misinformation, this should be censored. No one can talk about this idea. And finally, cooperative discourse helps us get closer to the truth. And censorship prevents this cooperative dialogue in many cases from ever happening to begin with. So let's say somebody had inside knowledge of the lab leak, say that happened, and someone has inside knowledge of it, and they see Zero Hedge's article on Twitter, and then they contact XYZ media outlet with extra information, and then that adds to sort of the public dialogue about this and what happened. Well, if that was censored from Twitter, the person doesn't see it, and then that doesn't happen. Or just sort of this general atmosphere of censoriousness stops people from speaking and coming forward to begin with, even if they have valuable information to add, that the public should be aware of. So I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, but so I just think that both of those claims, declaring something misinformation and then saying it should be censored, both of those things are really problematic. And that's about it for tonight, folks. And I want to thank you for listening, and do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Take care. Thank you.